Company is a game where you and 3 of your hopefully friends use useless, dog-shit equipment to go explore desolate hellscape moons to enter an abandoned labyrinth filled with horrors who can kill you nearly instantly. So you can get this literal garbage and trek it all the way back at a fucking snail's pace because a ring in this game weighs 15 goddamn pounds for some reason, so you can sell it to a giant faceless company, or whatever the fuck this is will kill you if you talk too loud. It's also one of the best games I've ever played. So today, I want to talk about why this game just works as well as it does. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, and let's get right into it. To start off, let's talk about information. Probably the most important part in a survival horror game. And just for an example of why limiting information can be so important, let me show you one clip from the game that I think showcases this best. Do you think this would have been more funny or more scary if the person who heard about his friend getting shot at by a nutcracker could actually see what was going on? Or is it a lot better in this case when you can only faintly hear what's going on? I think what you can create when you don't have the full picture is way scarier and often way funnier at the same time. And that's what I think information does really well. Obviously, the main part of this is the proximity voice chat. You can only hear people when you're near them, and they cut off immediately when they die.
Right.
And the sound is altered in so many ways to feel more realistic. Whether you hear people in corridors getting further away, the more crunchy audio coming from a walkie-talkie,
The audio of them underwater or with a snare flea over their head, muffling their voice in certain ways.
it does a lot to make the audio feel real to you in the moment, which I think is responsible for a lot of the cool interactions that have happened and clips that have blown up online. But it also does a good job of limiting what players can do. If you're all standing close together, you're not able to explore the facility effectively, so you have to split up to some degree. And because of that, each player doesn't get the information that the others do as easily, at least not without using equipment, which comes with its own downside we'll get to later. I think this both lends itself more to the comedic moments of the game, since it's a lot funnier when you can only see part of what's going on at times, as well as to the horror aspect, since oftentimes you may need information that other people aren't able to tell you, or at least you're not able to hear in the most clear way possible. A lot of the sound effects in the game also do a good job with this. Your screen has a little bit of an effect anytime you see a corpse. When gunshots go off, it can actually
Deafen your ears and prevent you from hearing.
and being haunted also messes with the noise. It does a good job of adding to it outside of the proximity voice chat too. The other aspect is the fact that the game has a lot of cover and a lot of limited sightline in mazes themselves. The interior is designed in a way for players to intentionally get split up from each other or even not to be able to see one another. Yes, of course, this cover could be useful against a lot of the enemies in the game, and I'm not denying that's a use case for it, but I think it's also very much intended to keep players from noticing what's going on. For example, even in mansions, the indoor type that's a lot more open, it's very clearly cluttered as hell with bookcases to prevent people from seeing properly. And finally, of course, is the lighting outdoors. It gets darker and darker throughout the day, along with weather effects like foggy that can either be tied to the weather itself or be inherent to some of the harder moons. These limit your information, but especially hurt you later in the day, which creates a source of panic as you'll need to try to get items back sooner or risk dealing with a lot more crap if you're going later, which I think just adds to the environment. The way the information is conveyed in the game, mixing with a lot of its other elements, is part of what creates all of the amazing and hilarious moments that have gotten the game to circulate.
Oh no! What do you mean?
So when we talk about the other attributes this game has, keep in mind that they all need to be contributing to this factor of information. So let's go through them and talk about not only how they work in their own right, but also how they contribute to this. Next up are the many enemies or monsters in Lethal Company, which I'll also just include some of the traps here. These have 3 main purposes. The main one is obvious: force you to change how you play the game a little bit. Is there a bracket in the facility? You better be spinning around constantly to make sure it doesn't sneak up behind you. Is there a coil head nearby? You're gonna have to look at it then. Is there a nutcracker nearby? You're gonna have to be careful not to move at all whenever it's actually looking around. Are you outside taking scrap back and see an eyeless dog? Well, it can hear you, so now you have to sneak around. Is there a giant outside? Well, it's line of sight based, so now you're moving around cover. Is there a butler inside? Well, then you're gonna have to stick with a group of people. This is basically the purpose of every single monster. Create some kind of difference in how you have to play the game. The harder the moons get, the more difficult the monsters are, as well as having generally more enemies, so that more things you have to consider when changing your game plan. Which brings me to my next point. The monsters should work well with each other. There's a lot of different synergy combos I could talk about, but I'll name a few of them in particular. One of the most well-known ones is the Bracken and Coilhead combo. Coilheads force you to look a certain direction, so typically you'll just have one player stand and watch them. But if they're not careful, they're the easiest target for a Bracken to go and kill since they can barely turn around and look at them. A more underrated combo that happens pretty rarely is the Bunker Spider and Jester. Bunker Spiders will typically set up a bunch of webs and kind of just patrol and trap a single area. But if that area is somewhere you need to go when trying to escape the facility before a Jester pops, it can end up being a much bigger threat. This also applies, of course, for the outside enemies, with probably the most common one being the Earth Leviathan and Eyeless Dog. The Earth Leviathan is slow, which you can easily maneuver around, but the Eyeless Dogs force you into this slow crouching state, meaning that you're going to have to sacrifice your counterplay on one of these monsters in order to deal with the other. This is also where a lot of the game's funny moments are created, and I want to point out some of the smart enemy designs I really like in this game. The clip I showed you guys earlier typically happens a lot with Nutcrackers, because due to the fact that they can kick you randomly, can see and shoot at you if you're moving around, and have a ranged attack, you typically only want to have one person trying to fight them at a time if you're going for the shotgun, which means for the other player, they can only hear the mini-boss music and occasional gunshots go off, which creates a lot more tension. The mimics are pretty smart in their own right with how they hide the mask from the player at several times, but I especially want to highlight the fact that they spin around to try to trick players to teleport them into the ship. It's a particularly smart method to keep people checking for their teammates a lot. If you hear someone running around without making a noise, you might check that it's an actual player because you have to be paranoid that it's a mimic. So any player sounds that don't get paired with a voice could potentially be from an enemy. And of course, the best example is definitely the Ghost Girl. Having an enemy that haunts you, distorting what you can hear and see at times, and also being something that only you can actually see is an incredibly effective method to create a lot of paranoia, especially if it's your first time encountering the enemy and the rest of your teammates are just actually confused. Finally though, progression. A lot of the earlier game enemies, while still possible to encounter on later moons, aren't much of a big deal after a while. Stuff like loot bugs provide some small early game challenges to beginners, like making sure to leave your scrap outside because people don't have the equipment or the skills to fight it as easily then. However, late game, players tend to be a lot better at fighting or avoiding monsters, so you need to add a bit more of a reward to the extra difficulty you're going to add. This is why stuff like Butler's Knife or Nutcracker's Shotgun are really important. They incentivize you to hunt more difficult enemies, but gives you a reward for doing so that allows you to deal with them more easily. This progression can also just be in the sense that there are more enemies that you can more easily manipulate. For example, the outdoor enemy, the Old Bird, while being one of the harder ones to deal with and having by far the most ways to try to kill you out of any enemy in the game, is also one that can be the most easily tricked into hunting all of the other outdoor enemies, something the players can actually use to their advantage. This progression in the monster difficulty to where you get more you can do with and against them means that players get a more unique experience on the harder moons, and it gives a sense of progression that players actually know what they're doing now and can start to use some of these enemies to their advantage, which is really great as long as it's balanced enough to where players still don't have too easy of a time. Next up, I want to take a look at the equipment and the scrap in Lethal Company. I want to highlight one decision I really like altogether, which is having the scrap and equipment have the same amount of inventory space that overlap with each other. Not only does 4 slots per teammate feel like just the right amount in order to manage your resources in this game, but it gives an important and necessary downside to every single piece of equipment immediately in the game, because whatever you're taking is something you can't use to be taking loot. For some items, this may mean leaving them in the facility, like low-cost flashlights in order to grab more pieces of loot later, while for others it means you're forced to carry one last item back to the ship every single time. I think the most important thing about equipment in this game is while it should have an important use case that helps you in its specific niche, it should still be bad at doing its job. For example, let's take a look at the Pro Flashlight. While it does illuminate the area, allowing you to, in theory, find scrap and explore faster, the fact that it adds 5 pounds to your weight and forces you to carry it around ground or drop it means that oftentimes it might actually be worth just using your own scan for a slight amount of illumination, or even might be less worth it than the cheaper flashlight, which you can at least leave in the facility since you can get more of them and doesn't have weight. But what's important to note is this doesn't take away from the utility of having a flashlight. Sometimes being able to light up the area is going to be worth these downsides, and when it is, that's when it's time to bring the equipment in. I think the lockpick might do this best of all. It allows you to open any door without a key, but comes with the downside of not only 11 pounds, which is quite a lot of weight, but also forces you to wait 30 seconds for that door to open. This not only serves its function of opening the door, but creates a new dilemma for the player of what you do with those 30 seconds. You could wait in front of the door or do nothing, or try to micromanage your time so you can maybe explore a smaller section of the facility and then come back and use the door. But that forces you to remember where you were and path correctly, which makes it a bit harder. This can even function for some of the terminal equipment on the ship that you don't have to have on your inventory. The best example for this, in my opinion, is the signal transmitter. While it allows you to send a signal for any of your teammates to see without any inventory space, it comes at the cost of not only having only 9 character slots, but sending in the absolute slowest way possible, which means if you're trying to urgently warn someone of something, it's going to take quite a bit longer than you might have wanted. And of course, my personal favorite example of these is TZP. While it's probably a little undertuned right now considering how expensive it is, the idea of being really fast to bring items back, especially two-handed ones you can't jetpack, but being also mostly blind all the way there is a really cool trade-off that I really enjoy. It's especially fun to try to learn and get good at, and it feels really satisfying to bring something like a cash register back to the ship without ever having to recharge your stamina. These kind of trade-offs and weaknesses of the items I think provides a lot of satisfying ways to use it. And that's another thing that I like about all these items. I think them being weaker makes them a lot more satisfying in this game. The fact that they're all working against you in one way or another means proper use of the item feels really great. The shovel has another good example of this. It's incredibly heavy and incredibly short range, needing multiple hits to kill pretty much anything, but that means actually being able to pull it off is really cool. The best part about this system is the scrap can function in a lot of the same ways as I've described a lot of the equipment. The lamp, for example, can provide lighting, which sometimes is helpful, but also sometimes makes it harder to see, particularly if you're trying to navigate some of the snowy moons like Rend. There's options like the laser pointer, which could be used like a mini flashlight, but if you want to keep it for that, you're obviously not bringing it back to the ship, as well as some of the more expensive scrap having downsides, like the robot toy, which is fairly good for its price and weight, making a bunch of noise unless if you want to spend time constantly picking it up until it gets quiet. And even low value scrap that has a lot more downsides, like the whoopee cushion, which can make noise that alerts things like dogs, are still worth it when you're trying to get as much scrap as possible back to the ship. And finally, the last items I'd like to highlight are your two major items, the cash registers and gold bars. These are rare, high-value items that are most common on the hardest moon in the game, and the mad scramble to try to get something that weighs like 80 pounds back to the ship to be able to get something upwards of $150 to $200 potentially is incredibly fun. And not only makes them feel rewarding when you find them, but it provides a unique mechanic since they weigh so much more than everything else that you really have to be careful how you bring it back. The equipment and scrap in the game creates a lot of interesting decision making based on having usefulness but being really difficult to actually use, especially to the point of if you want to use it in the first place, that I think adds a lot of moment-to-moment strategy and decision making. Now that all of the base game has been established, I want to talk a little bit about the updates. And before we get into some of the more specific content itself, I want to talk about a little bit of the direction of the game. Because I think the biggest controversy between version 49 and 50 is the nerfs to the player. Whether that be through the removal of unintentional mechanics, such as sprint sneaking or crouch cheesing, or nerfs to player equipment, such as the shovel getting a weight increase and the jetpack getting a significant nerf. I can definitely see a lot of players preferring version 49 before this, especially if you got used to using a lot of these techs, but it's very clear that from this pattern of changes, the game is going with a simple idea of trying to keep the player power in check. There are a lot of games that should be trying to make the players feel as powerful as possible. Splatoon has a good example of this, where some of the most remembered weapons are those with strong kits, things that give you tools that synergize with what you want to do that also feel powerful, like they can work consistently. But Lethal Company is survival horror. It's not supposed to feel that way. If anything, if the player is too powerful and has too much control over their settings, it takes away a lot from the game's atmosphere and makes things too reliable. It's not as entertaining knowing you'll probably be able to make it out with decent space and loot every single time. And so the real question should be if these mechanics trivialize the game too much. Does sprint sneaking make dealing with eyeless dogs too easy? In that case, it shouldn't be in the game. This game has to make you feel really weak. Like, the tools you're using are things that barely actually function. Something like the vanilla undercover umbrella, for instance, which, while it can make some pretty impressive plays, are incredibly rare because you have so many pieces that barely function and barely have any synergy with itself. The only thing I think we need to be careful of when these are adjusted is making sure it's not overdoing it. If the shovel's nerfed by too much, nobody is going to pick it, and that's a problem for equipment you want to buy. Using this item should be better than not having it at all, which so far I think still holds true, to be clear. I could definitely see people's points where maybe something like sprint sneaking should be nerfed rather than completely removed, but at the same time, these balance changes do directly lead to the design of the game, and I think it is really easy to get bored if it gets too easy. So making it so that the players constantly have to struggle, even for experienced players, is a game direction that I have to respect. Future Chara stepping in here. I recorded this at 50.4 because I was almost certain, given that it lined up with the other game design choices, that this wouldn't be reverted. And what do you know? I was wrong. The jetpack was reverted. Zeeker stated on version 50's release post that they had targeted jetpack's crazy efficiency for the same reason, safely bypassing a part of the game, but realized that it had an irreplaceable purpose as a wacky gimmick item, so I will respect that. Which confirms my theory that the jetpack change does still line up with everything I've been talking about here, but it's cool to see that if an item is still really gimmicky, wacky fun, that Zeekers is willing to walk it back in order for the community to have more fun with it. It's great to have that kind of communication from a developer. I respect that. Anyway, let's talk about the actual content of these updates. It's pretty insane just how much content, especially between moons and enemies, that version 50 actually has, and between all of that, it still does a lot in terms of balance tweaking to try to make a lot of the different moons, equipment, and enemies feel like they have a lot more variety. On top of this, all these new ideas seem to be constantly testing something or adding something new. The butler's an assassin type enemy that we haven't had in indoors before. Having an outdoor enemy that can pick you up and fly you around is also pretty new. And they all keep this unique style that can switch between silly and scary at the same time, which I think fit really well. My favorite addition is honestly the old birds. They are a very difficult enemy you only see in the late game. They're very line of sight based, which makes me think of them like old giants, but they feel a lot more fair to deal with. They don't camp areas as easily since they tend to fly around, and getting spotted doesn't mean GG, though it is a lot of pain. They honestly add strategy to the outdoors that I think enhance all of the other enemies that are out there, since you can potentially use old birds against them. It was really cool to see that. The video's long enough, so I don't want to talk about the update stuff too much, but I just do want to say that it looks like when these updates do drop, they definitely have a lot in store for keeping the game fresh and expanding on new ideas. To wrap up this video, I was going to talk about a bit of my complaints and critiques, but honestly, version 50 fixed most of them. There's some small stuff I would like. I think Titan could use a second fire exit on the left side with how big the interior is and how underused that side of the map is. I think the buying and selling system is incredibly slow and tedious late game, but my only real major complaint about the game, and the only part I think could use some optimization, is having players be able to do more when they're dead. What exactly they would do, I have no idea. It seems really difficult to balance since obviously you don't want to incentivize people dying. But the worst feeling I have in this game is dying within the first minute or two and then just sitting there for 10 minutes watching everyone else play the game. And even that's not that big a deal. Instead, I want to just bring a point to everything I've been talking about in this video. I think the design of Lethal Company is incredibly tight-knit. There's definitely way more AAA games out there that have so much more filling out the game. But honestly, I prefer Lethal Company the way it is. I could see a version of this game that was produced by a company that's way more bloated with content, but it's of way lower quality, and I just don't think I would enjoy it as much. I play Lethal Company mostly vanilla, with only quality of life mods and of course more company to be able to play with more of my friends, and honestly, that's the best experience I can get a lot of the time. I think that a lot of games these days could be improved by having less stuff in it, but having more time to make sure the stuff you're putting in the game is well polished, and especially for a game that's being developed by one person, I think Zeekers has done an incredibly good job with it. If this is how updates are going to continue, then I think the game has a fantastic future. And honestly, it's just really impressed me playing it. It's been a game that I got into a little bit because of friends and just thought, damn, this is cool every single time I find a new interaction. And that's led to me making this video. I hope this encouraged you to try out Lethal Company if you haven't already. It's only $10 on Steam. Thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know what you think of one of my first variety discussions, and I will see you all next time.